On that fateful evening in mid-November 1942, just off the shores of Guadalcanal, Commander Thomas Stokes found himself in a position that defied every conventional understanding of maritime combat. Standing aboard the USS Fletcher, a vessel that had seen merely half a year of service, he observed his ship racing forward through dark waters at speeds exceeding 30 knots. Their destination was a Japanese naval formation that included some of the ocean's most formidable fighting machines. Vessels whose displacement exceeded his own by tenfold or more, equipped with weaponry capable of devastating a destroyer from distances where his own armament would prove essentially useless. The night air was thick with salt spray and tension as the Fletcher cut through the waves, her bow throwing up phosphorescent foam that glowed briefly before disappearing into the darkness. Every man aboard understood the gravity of their situation. The Japanese force ahead represented everything that naval warfare doctrine said should destroy them. These were not merely larger ships, but floating fortresses of steel, armed with guns that could fire shells weighing over a ton each, shells that could obliterate a destroyer with a single direct hit. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple and seemingly insurmountable. Traditional naval wisdom declared such an approach to be nothing short of self-destruction. Destroyers served specific purposes within fleet operations: reconnaissance, protective screening, platforms for launching torpedoes under cover of night before making hasty retreats. They were never intended to engage capital ships in direct artillery exchanges. The entire history of naval warfare reinforced this understanding. Destroyers were the cavalry of the sea, swift and dangerous when used properly, but vulnerable when exposed to the full might of battleship firepower. They were meant to dance at the edges of battle, not charge into its heart. Yet Commander Stokes possessed an advantage invisible to his adversaries, an advantage that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in ways that decades of naval tradition could not anticipate. Mounted atop his fire control director sat equipment capable of tracking hostile vessels at ranges where Japanese observers struggled to perceive anything through the darkness. This wasn't merely a detection device, but a complete system that integrated sensing, calculating, and targeting into a seamless whole. His targeting systems could deliver ordnance onto targets under conditions where enemy gunners operated essentially blind, groping in darkness while American shells found their marks with mechanical precision. His instructions were unambiguous: approach the enemy and initiate combat. These orders represented a complete departure from traditional destroyer employment. No longer were these vessels expected to merely harass and withdraw. They were being sent in as primary combatants, expected to close with and engage forces that outweighed and outgunned them by enormous margins. This was a new kind of warfare, one that placed technology and aggression above the careful calculations of gun size and armor, thickness that had dominated naval thinking for generations. The events that unfolded during the subsequent hours would pose a question that would perplex Japanese naval commanders throughout the remainder of the conflict, a question that would gnaw at their confidence and erode their certainty in doctrines they had spent decades perfecting. How had their carefully developed strategic principles failed them? Why were these American destroyers, relatively modest warships supposedly inferior in capability, proving themselves to be the most formidable surface combatants encountered throughout Pacific waters? The answers would prove both simpler and more complex than anyone anticipated, rooted in technological advancement but amplified by tactical innovation and an industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than they occurred. The explanation resided not in any isolated technological superiority or innovative tactical approach, but rather in a fundamental misunderstanding of what naval warfare would actually become in this theater. The Japanese had prepared their forces for a particular style of conflict, one that emphasized the qualities they possessed in abundance: superior training, aggressive spirit, excellent torpedoes, and the willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of decisive engagement. The Americans, through a combination of circumstance and adaptation, had introduced an entirely different form of warfare, one that valued technological advantage, systematic training, industrial production, and the ruthless application of firepower from ranges where traditional skills meant little. The destroyer, that essential workhorse present in abundance within both fleets, would expose the chasm between anticipated and actual combat conditions in the most devastating manner imaginable. These vessels, which both navies possessed in large numbers, would become the laboratory where competing philosophies of warfare collided. The Japanese destroyer represented one vision: a fast, aggressively handled torpedo platform crewed by men trained to the highest standards of traditional naval warfare. The American destroyer represented another, a technologically advanced gun platform that could fight effectively in any conditions, crewed by men trained to operate complex equipment, rather than rely on individual skill and courage alone. Japanese mariners who survived encounters with American destroyers described these vessels with a specific quality of fear during post-war interrogations, a fear that went beyond the normal anxiety of combat. This wasn't the respectful acknowledgement they granted to American aircraft carriers and battleships, massive vessels whose power was obvious and comprehensible within traditional naval frameworks. Nor was it the dismissiveness they reserved for submarines that attacked from concealment, weapons they considered somehow dishonorable in their refusal to face opponents directly. This was genuine dread, the variety that emerges when confronting an adversary that accomplishes what you believed impossible, that advances when retreat seems logical, that strikes you through darkness from ranges where visual contact remains impossible, that continues approaching even after absorbing damage sufficient to send most vessels to the ocean floor. This dread had a particular quality that distinguished it from the fear any sailor might feel in combat. It was the fear of fighting an enemy that operated by different rules, that possessed capabilities you couldn't match, that could see you when you were blind and strike you when you couldn't strike back. It was the fear of knowing that your years of training, your superior equipment in some areas, your tactical doctrine, none of it mattered against an opponent who had found a way to make the fight unfold on their terms rather than yours. It was the fear of obsolescence, of being rendered irrelevant, not by superior courage or skill, but by technology you didn't possess and couldn't acquire. This account explores why Japanese naval forces developed such profound fear of American destroyers compared to any other surface combatant. It examines radar technology and doctrinal approaches, training methodologies and industrial production capacity, the psychological dimensions of nocturnal combat, and the terror of being outmatched by a supposedly inferior opponent. Most significantly, it addresses the moment when Japanese confidence, constructed upon years of achievement and meticulous preparation, encountered a reality for which they had made no provisions. This was not merely a story of technological advantage, but of how that advantage cascaded through every aspect of naval combat, creating situations where traditional excellence became liability and conventional wisdom led to disaster. Understanding why American destroyers became such sources of dread requires comprehending what the Japanese anticipated from Pacific naval warfare, the vision they had spent 2 decades developing and refining. Their entire strategic approach, refined across the years between global conflicts, was constructed upon specific assumptions regarding how modern maritime battles would proceed. These assumptions weren't arbitrary or foolish. They emerged from careful examination of previous conflicts, extensive preparation that consumed enormous resources, and genuine combat experience that seemed to validate their approach. They represented the considered judgment of professional naval officers who had studied their craft seriously and applied themselves to mastering it. They were also about to prove catastrophically insufficient, not because they were inherently wrong, but because warfare itself was changing in ways that rendered traditional skills less relevant. The Japanese had prepared to fight the last war, or rather an idealized version of it, while circumstances were creating an entirely new kind of conflict. This is a common tragedy in military history. Forces prepared and trained for one kind of warfare finding themselves engaged in another, their advantages neutralized and their weaknesses exposed by changed conditions they hadn't anticipated. The Imperial Japanese Navy, entering 1941, represented the product of intentional, thoughtful strategic development spanning decades. This was not a force that had stumbled into war unprepared or ignorant. Japan had analyzed the experiences of the First World War with meticulous attention to detail, particularly the engagement between British and German battleship fleets at Jutland in 1916. Japanese officials had served as British allies during that conflict, and their observers had studied events meticulously, taking extensive notes and conducting detailed analysis of what had succeeded and what had failed. They noted that decisive moments in naval warfare occurred when primary battle lines engaged, when battleships dueled with battleships at ranges spanning 15 to 20,000 yards. Every other element within the fleet existed to facilitate that critical moment, that clash of titans that would determine control of the seas. This understanding shaped everything about Japanese naval development in the interwar years. They built battleships with massive guns and thick armor. They developed tactics for fleet engagement that emphasized bringing overwhelming force to bear at the decisive point. They created training programs that prepared officers and sailors for the kind of close-range, violent engagement they expected would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. Every exercise, every war game, every tactical problem they studied reinforced this vision of naval warfare as a contest between battle fleets meeting in formal engagement. Within this framework, destroyers held specific functions that were clearly defined and understood. They screened the battle fleet against enemy destroyers and submarines, providing a protective layer around the precious battleships and cruisers that represented the real striking power of the fleet. They conducted torpedo attacks, preferably during nighttime when they could approach unseen to effective striking distance, using darkness and surprise to offset their vulnerability to heavy gunfire. Critically, they were considered expendable assets in the grand strategic game. The destroyer represented a sacrificial element in the strategic game of fleet engagement, a piece you could afford to lose if doing so created advantages for your capital. Ships, their purpose was inflicting sufficient damage upon enemy capital, ships that one's own. Battleships could complete their destruction, softening up targets and creating opportunities for the decisive blow. If destroyers were lost during this process, such losses were acceptable, even expected. They cost considerably less than battleships in terms of resources, construction time, and trained personnel. You could replace a destroyer far more easily than a battleship. This economic calculation was perfectly rational within the framework of expected naval warfare, where battles would be decided by the clash of capital ships and everything else was supporting cast. This doctrinal approach shaped every aspect of Japanese destroyer design and crew, preparation in ways both obvious and subtle. The Japanese developed what became known as the Type 93 torpedo, designated by Allied forces as the Long Lance, a name that captured both respect and fear. This represented an extraordinary weapon by any standard, measuring 24 inches in diameter and carrying over 1,000 pounds of high explosive material, enough to cripple or sink almost any warship if it struck a vital area. It could achieve ranges of 22,000 yards while traveling at 48 knots, or extend to 40,000 yards at 36 knots, ranges that seemed almost impossible to those unfamiliar with the weapon's capabilities. These weren't merely theoretical specifications, touted in promotional materials but verified, capabilities tested through countless training exercises under realistic conditions. The Long Lance utilized oxygen fuel instead of compressed air, a technically challenging approach that provided enormous advantages. It produced virtually no wake, making detection at night nearly impossible even by alert lookouts, watching carefully for the telltale white streaks that marked conventional torpedo tracks. An enemy might never know torpedoes were approaching until they struck, and by then it would be far too late to take evasive action. This gave Japanese destroyers the ability to strike from concealment, to inflict devastating damage before the enemy even knew they were under attack. Japanese destroyer crews underwent relentless training in nocturnal combat, operations that exceeded anything their American counterparts experienced in the pre-war years. They practiced visual identification of vessel silhouettes until they could recognize ship types within seconds based on subtle differences in mast arrangement, funnel shape, and overall profile. This wasn't casual familiarization, but intensive drilling that continued until recognition became automatic, requiring no conscious thought. They drilled on rapid torpedo reloading procedures, practicing the complex and dangerous work of handling heavy torpedoes on pitching decks in darkness until they could accomplish it smoothly and quickly. Certain Japanese destroyers possessed the capability to reload torpedo tubes while underway, an ability American destroyers lacked entirely. This gave them the potential for multiple attacks in a single engagement, vastly increasing their striking power. They perfected techniques for launching torpedoes in coordinated patterns, with multiple destroyers firing simultaneously to saturate target areas with warheads, creating overlapping fields of destruction that made evasion nearly impossible. This wasn't simple salvo firing, but carefully choreographed attacks where timing and positioning mattered enormously, where slight errors could mean torpedoes missing by hundreds of yards, while perfect execution could cripple an entire enemy formation. During the early months of Pacific combat, this doctrinal approach functioned brilliantly, exceeding even Japanese expectations. On the night spanning August 8th and 9th, 1942, off Savo Island near Guadalcanal, A Japanese cruiser force demonstrated precisely what their night fighting preparation could accomplish when applied against an unprepared enemy. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commanded 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, a force substantially smaller than what faced him, but superior in the qualities that mattered for nocturnal engagement. They approached American and Australian forces screening the Guadalcanal landing operations, forces that should have been alert but weren't, that possessed technological advantages they didn't know how to use effectively. The Allied force possessed superior numbers by any count: 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers. On paper, this force should have been able to defeat Mikawa's smaller formation with relative ease. The Japanese operated without radar, a technology they had not yet deployed widely and whose significance they didn't fully appreciate. Allied vessels carried primitive radar equipment, though operators were still developing proficiency in its use, struggling with false returns, unclear displays, and a lack of tactical doctrine for employing radar information effectively. However, the Japanese possessed something more valuable in the immediate tactical situation: superbly trained lookouts, whose eyes had been trained to extract maximum information from minimal light, and years of nocturnal combat drilling that had made night fighting second nature to them. At 33 minutes past 1 in the morning, Japanese lookouts identified the Allied picket destroyer USS Blue, a vessel whose purpose was specifically to detect and report approaching enemy forces. The Japanese column passed within several thousand yards of Blue without detection, a passage that should have been impossible given Blue's mission and position. Blue's radar, if operational, failed to register the Japanese vessels, either because it wasn't functioning properly or because operators didn't recognize what they were seeing on their displays. Her lookouts, untrained in the night vision techniques the Japanese had perfected through countless hours of practice, observed nothing, even though enemy ships passed within visual range. This was a failure not of courage or attention, but of training and preparation. The Americans simply hadn't learned yet what night combat required, hadn't understood that seeing in darkness was a skill that required extensive development. At 38 minutes past 1, Japanese lookouts identified additional vessels: the heavy cruisers USS Chicago and HMAS Canberra, along with destroyers USS Patterson and USS Bagley. These ships represented substantial combat power, capable of inflicting serious damage on Mikawa's force if they could bring their guns to bear. Admiral Mikawa ordered his force to prepare for action, a command that initiated a well-rehearsed sequence of activities. Torpedo crews moved to their positions with practiced efficiency, preparing their deadly long-lance weapons for launch. Gun crews loaded armor-piercing ammunition, shells designed to penetrate the thick plating that protected enemy cruisers. The range closed to under 5,000 yards, a distance where gunfire would be devastatingly effective. Where even minor caliber weapons could inflict serious damage, Allied ships still hadn't detected the Japanese presence, their radar operators either not seeing the approaching vessels or not recognizing what their instruments were telling them. The Americans were blind and unaware, steaming on their assigned courses with no idea that enemy forces were approaching torpedo range. This was the nightmare scenario for any naval force: to be caught completely unprepared by an enemy who knew exactly where you were and was positioning for attack. At 43 minutes past 1, the Japanese commenced firing, and the carefully planned attack unfolded with devastating efficiency. Illumination rounds burst above the Allied formation, lighting up targets with harsh magnesium light that turned night into artificial day. These star shells served multiple purposes. They illuminated targets for Japanese gunners, while simultaneously blinding Allied lookouts, whose eyes were adapted to darkness. Within seconds, torpedoes entered the water, their oxygen-fueled engines leaving almost no trace as they raced toward their targets. Main battery guns were firing, shells arcing across the short distance between Japanese and Allied ships. The engagement proved brutally one-sided in a way that shocked even the attacking Japanese. Canberra absorbed 24 hits in less than 2 minutes, a concentration of fire that overwhelmed her damage control capabilities instantly. She was immobilized, her engines destroyed, aflame from stem to stern, her commanding officer killed along with many of his crew. Chicago took a torpedo hit that blew open her bow, but managed to survive through combination of good damage control and good fortune. Patterson identified the Japanese and attempted to raise the alarm, but by then circumstances had become irreversible. The warning came too late to save the ships under attack, too late to allow them to maneuver or return fire effectively. The Japanese column swept past the southern screening force, their crews working with practiced efficiency to reload guns and prepare for the next phase of their attack, and turned northward toward the second group of Allied cruisers, USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, and USS Astoria. These three heavy cruisers were completely unprepared for attack, having received no clear warning from the ships to the south. Some crew members remained at sleep stations, off watch and unaware that battle had been joined only miles away. The Japanese attacked at ranges under 5,000 yards with guns and torpedoes, bringing overwhelming firepower to bear before the Americans could respond effectively. By 15 minutes past 2, all three American cruisers were sinking or abandoned. Massive vessels that had cost tens of millions of dollars and years of construction time, each carrying hundreds of trained sailors. Over 1,000 Allied sailors had perished in less than an hour of combat, killed by shell fire, drowning as their ships sank, or dying of wounds in the oil-covered waters. The Japanese suffered minimal damage with fewer than 60 total casualties, a disparity that seemed to validate every aspect of their training and doctrine. This was what superior preparation was supposed to accomplish, what years of night combat training was meant to achieve. Savo Island represented a catastrophe for Allied forces that would have ramifications for months to come, affecting planning, morale, and tactical approach. It was also a validation of everything the Japanese believed regarding nocturnal combat, proof that their methods worked even against technologically superior opponents. Their training proved effective, their tactics succeeded, their torpedoes performed devastatingly well, exceeding even optimistic estimates of their effectiveness. The Americans, despite possessing radar and numerical superiority, had been utterly defeated in a battle that wasn't even particularly close. The Japanese had done exactly what their doctrine said they should be able to do. Approached unseen, struck devastating blows, and withdrawn before the enemy could organize effective resistance. Japanese naval officers examined battle reports with satisfaction, analyzing the engagement in detail to extract lessons and identify areas for improvement. This confirmed their doctrinal approach and justified the countless hours of training they had demanded from their crews. Night combat, aggressive tactics, superior training, and the long lance torpedo provided them with decisive advantages that could overcome enemy numerical or technological superiority. American forces might possess more vessels and better industrial production capacity, but in actual nocturnal combat at sea, Japanese destroyers and cruisers would dominate. This wasn't arrogance, but rational conclusion based on demonstrated performance. What the Japanese couldn't have understood in those initial months following Savo Island was that the Americans were already addressing the problem systematically, not through enhanced training or superior tactics alone, but through technology that would fundamentally transform the nature of naval combat. The Americans had suffered a devastating defeat, but they were learning from it in ways that would prove decisive. They were analyzing what had happened, understanding why their radar hadn't prevented disaster, developing new training programs and tactical doctrines that would turn technological advantage into battlefield victory. The solution was radar fire control, and it would convert the destroyer from a screening vessel into the most dangerous surface combatant throughout the Pacific theater. This wasn't just adding radar to existing ships, but integrating radar into a complete fire control system that changed how ships fought. American destroyers during 1942 were receiving the Mark 37 gun director system, equipment that represented a revolutionary advance in naval gunnery. This wasn't merely radar equipment for detecting vessels at sea, though it could certainly do that. It represented an integrated fire control system capable of tracking targets continuously, calculating firing solutions automatically, and directing guns with a precision that human gunners couldn't match. The Mark 37 consisted of a director mounted high on the vessel, typically on a platform above the bridge where it had clear fields of view in all directions, containing a radar antenna, optical rangefinders for backup and verification, and mechanical computers that solved gunnery problems continuously. These computers were marvels of analog engineering, using gears, cams, and differential mechanisms to perform complex calculations in real time. The radar component could detect surface targets at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards under favorable conditions, far beyond the limits of human vision even in daylight. More importantly, it could track targets continuously, providing range, bearing, and speed information directly to the fire control computer without human intervention beyond initial target designation. The computer, a mechanical analog device of remarkable sophistication considering it predated electronic computers entirely, calculated necessary gun elevation and bearing to strike moving targets. This was an enormously complex problem involving multiple variables all changing simultaneously. It accounted for own ship speed and course, which affected the gun's relationship to the target. It accounted for target speed and course, which determined where the target would be when shells arrived, rather than where it was when fired. It accounted for wind conditions that could deflect shells during their flight. It even accounted for Earth's rotation for long-range shots, a factor that mattered when shells were in flight for tens of seconds. The Mark 37 could place 5-inch shells on target in complete darkness at ranges where Japanese lookouts couldn't even perceive enemy vessels, creating situations where American ships could engage enemies that had no idea they were under attack. It could maintain fire control through smoke, rain, or any other condition that blinded optical systems, allowing American destroyers to fight effectively in weather that would have halted traditional naval combat. Critically, it could accomplish this while the firing ship maneuvered at high speed, maintaining accurate fire while charging forward at 30 knots or executing violent evasive maneuvers. Japanese gunnery doctrine relied on stable firing platforms, an approach that made sense given the limitations of optical fire control. You reduced speed to provide a steady platform for your rangefinders and directors, steadied your course to simplify the gunnery problem, then fired. Maneuvering meant your firing solutions became invalid, requiring new calculations. The Mark 37 allowed American destroyers to fire accurately while charging forward at 30 knots or more, while turning violently to evade enemy fire, while doing anything the captain deemed tactically necessary. This gave American destroyers freedom of action that Japanese ships lacked, the ability to maneuver and fight simultaneously rather than choosing between the two. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun arming. American destroyers was itself a remarkable weapon that complemented the fire control system perfectly. Designed during the 1920s as a dual-purpose gun capable of engaging both surface targets and aircraft, it represented forward-thinking design that proved enormously valuable when war came. The 38 designation referred to barrel length, 38 times the bore diameter, or 190 inches total. This relatively long barrel provided excellent accuracy and good range while remaining manageable in terms of weight and balance aboard a destroyer. Each gun could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute depending on crew training and conditions, a rate of fire that seemed impossible until you watched well-trained crews in action, working with mechanical precision to load, aim, and fire in smooth rhythm. The ammunition handling was simplified compared to larger naval guns, with shells and propellant charges combined into single fixed rounds that one man could handle. This meant fewer steps in the loading cycle, and less opportunity for mistakes that could slow firing rate. Shells weighed 55 pounds for high explosive rounds and 54 pounds for armor piercing, large enough to inflict serious damage but small enough for manual handling. A Fletcher-class destroyer, the standard American destroyer design from 1942 onward, and the ship type that would define American destroyer operations for the remainder of the war, carried 5 of these guns in individual mounts. 3 were positioned forward of the bridge, providing heavy concentration of firepower ahead, 2 aft to provide defensive capability and allow firing on targets astern. This arrangement gave excellent coverage in most tactical situations. With all 5 guns firing at maximum rate, a single Fletcher could deliver 75 to 100 rounds per minute downrange, a volume of fire that could overwhelm enemy damage control and inflict devastating cumulative damage even on larger ships. The shells weren't large enough to seriously damage battleships or heavy cruisers under normal circumstances, not able to penetrate the thick armor belts that protected these vessels' vital spaces. But they proved devastating against destroyers, light cruisers, and any other lightly armored target, which included virtually everything except battleships and heavy cruisers. They could wreck unarmored or lightly armored superstructures on larger ships, destroying fire control stations, communication equipment, bridge facilities, anything exposed above the armored deck. When directed by radar fire control, they struck with uncanny accuracy, landing hit after hit in rapid succession. The genuine revolution wasn't simply in striking targets with greater accuracy, though that mattered enormously. It resided in what radar fire control did to the psychology of naval combat, transforming encounters from tests of courage and skill into exercises in technological advantage. Japanese doctrine assumed nocturnal combat meant close-range chaos, where training and aggression determined outcomes, where the side that could see better and shoot faster would prevail. American destroyers with radar could engage at ranges where the Japanese couldn't effectively return fire, maintaining what tacticians called standoff range, close enough to hit effectively, but far enough to avoid the worst of enemy fire. They could maintain distance, delivering continuous 5-inch gunfire with mechanical precision, never closing to torpedo range where Japanese destroyers excelled, and where their long-lance weapons would be devastatingly effective. This was profoundly frustrating for Japanese commanders who had prepared for brutal close-range engagements where their training advantages would matter, where crew quality and aggressive tactics would determine outcomes. What they encountered instead was an adversary that could perceive them when they were blind, that could strike them from distances where their own weapons proved ineffective or impossible to aim accurately, that fought with methodical precision, rendering Japanese training advantages largely irrelevant. The psychological impact proved profound in ways that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. You couldn't out-train radar through any amount of practice or dedication. The most skilled lookout in the world couldn't see through darkness better than a radar set that sent out electronic pulses and received their reflections. You couldn't out-aggress a weapon system that struck you before you knew it existed, before you could even see the enemy ship to determine its type and position. The courage to close with the enemy meant nothing if you were being hit before you could identify what you needed to close with. The first full demonstration of what American radar fire control could accomplish came during the early hours of November 13, 1942, in Guadalcanal waters. This marked the first night of what would be called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a complex series of engagements that would span several days and nights. It would be chaotic, with ships from both sides intermixed in confused fighting. But within that chaos, American destroyers would demonstrate capabilities that shocked Japanese commanders who had grown confident after Savo Island, capabilities that suggested American technological development was changing the fundamental nature of night combat. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan commanded 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, a respectable force but one hastily assembled and not particularly well coordinated. His mission was intercepting a Japanese bombardment force headed for Guadalcanal. 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 14 destroyers under Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe. The Japanese force was vastly more powerful on paper, with the battleships representing striking power that destroyers and cruisers couldn't match in direct engagement. The battleships Hiei and Kirishima each displaced over 30,000 tons and carried 14-inch main guns, weapons that could destroy destroyers with single hits and cripple cruisers with several hits. However, Callahan's destroyers had radar, and more importantly, they had commanders learning how to utilize it effectively in tactical situations. This wasn't just about detecting enemy ships, but about integrating radar information into tactical decisions, understanding what radar could and couldn't tell you, learning to trust the technology even when it contradicted visual observation. At 24 minutes past 1 in the morning, radar aboard USS Helena, a light cruiser, detected the Japanese force at 27,000 yards, a range where visual observation was completely impossible in the darkness. The American formation was in disarray, ships scattered across several thousand yards of ocean. Rather than maintaining tight formation, communication between vessels poor and getting worse as the situation developed. Callahan's tactical plan, based on pre-radar doctrine that assumed you needed to maintain visual contact to fight effectively, had already collapsed as ships lost sight of each other in the darkness. But his destroyers could perceive the enemy. Even in pitch darkness, their radar operators calling out ranges and bearings as the Japanese force approached. The Japanese, despite their superior night vision training and careful lookout procedures, observed nothing yet, unaware that they had already been detected and that American ships were maneuvering into position. The American formation closed on the Japanese force, ranges dropping steadily as both sides converged. Range dropped to 14,000 yards, still beyond visual contact, then 10,000 yards, where in daylight you might begin to see ship hulls on the horizon. The Japanese still hadn't detected them, not because of poor lookouts or inadequate training, but because American ships were approaching from an unexpected direction, and the Japanese weren't searching that sector as carefully as others. They expected resistance closer to Guadalcanal, not here in the approaches. At 41 minutes past 1, with range under 5,000 yards where ships would be visible on any clear night, Japanese lookouts finally identified the American force, seeing silhouettes suddenly appear where none had been visible moments before. Admiral Abe, who had been expecting to bombard Guadalcanal unopposed and had positioned his force accordingly, realized he was in a surface engagement. His battleship's main guns were loaded with bombardment ammunition rather than armor-piercing shells for anti-ship work. His formation was arranged for bombardment approach rather than surface combat. This surprise was only possible because the Americans had seen him first and closed without being detected, a situation that would have been impossible without radar. What followed was indeed chaos at its most intense. At such close range, with ships from both sides intermixed in the darkness, radar advantage became less decisive than it was at longer ranges. Ships were so close that lookouts could see them. That visual observation became possible and meaningful again. Japanese training in close-range combat demonstrated its value immediately. The battle became a brutal knife fight at ranges under 5,000 yards, sometimes under 3,000 yards, distances where every ship could hit every other ship, and where armor and damage control determined survival more than technological advantage. Ships on both sides were torn apart by point-blank gunfire, shells striking at such close range that penetration was almost guaranteed. The destroyer USS Cushing took a hit from Hiei's 14-inch guns that nearly severed her in half, the massive shell passing completely through the destroyer's hull and exploding on the far side, the blast breaking her keel and dooming her to sink within minutes. USS Laffey was battered by multiple ships firing simultaneously and sank within minutes, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire directed at her. The cruiser, USS Atlanta, was struck by friendly fire and Japanese shells simultaneously, American shells hitting her from one side while Japanese shells struck from another, setting her ablaze and killing many crew members, including her commanding officer. Yet American destroyers fought with ferocity that stunned the Japanese observers, fighting with intensity that seemed to border on recklessness but was actually calculated aggression enabled by their fire control systems. It wasn't just that American destroyers won more often than they lost, though that was certainly true. It was that they won by breaking all the rules that Japanese doctrine said should govern naval combat, by doing things that shouldn't have worked according to traditional principles, by turning the supposedly weaker piece on the board into the most dangerous threat. That's the cost of truth in naval warfare, the price of having your assumptions proven wrong by hard experience. Once you realize your doctrine is obsolete, once you understand your training can't overcome technological disadvantage, once you know the enemy has more ships, better equipment, and tactics you can't effectively counter, you still have to fight. You still have to take your destroyer out into waters where American destroyers with radar are hunting. You still have to close to torpedo range knowing they can see you first and start shooting before you know they're there. You still have to fight knowing you're probably not coming back, that the odds are against survival, let alone victory. The Japanese learned to dread American destroyers more than any other ship type in the Pacific, and that dread persisted through the final years of the war, even as they continued fighting. Not because American destroyers were the most powerful ships afloat, which they weren't. Battleships had bigger guns, carriers had longer reach, cruisers had heavier armor, but American destroyers proved that power isn't everything in warfare, that a smaller ship with better technology and aggressive tactics could defeat larger ships with superior traditional capabilities. That industrial capacity and systematic tactical evolution could overcome individual excellence and warrior spirit, no matter how intensely cultivated. These were lessons Japanese naval doctrine had no framework to process, no mechanism for adapting to because they struck at fundamental assumptions about how war worked. And so dread remained. That sick feeling that came with radar pips appearing on screens you didn't have, with shells landing before you could see the enemy ship firing them, with torpedoes in the water from ships you thought you'd outranged or could defeat in fair combat. American destroyers rewrote naval warfare in the Pacific theater, changed the rules in ways that couldn't be unchanged. The Japanese, who had pioneered night combat tactics and built some of the war's finest torpedoes and trained their crews to standards their enemies acknowledged, discovered their expertise meant nothing against an enemy that saw in the dark and just kept building more ships faster than they could be sunk. That was the truth that Commander Thomas Stokes understood on the bridge of USS Fletcher that November night in 1942, the reality that was still emerging but already visible to those who could see it. The war wouldn't be won by who trained harder or who had better tactics in the traditional sense. It would be won by who had radar that made darkness transparent, industrial capacity that made losses replaceable, and destroyers that fought with technological advantage amplifying aggressive tactics. Ships that treated battleships as targets rather than threats to be avoided. That understanding would spread through American destroyer forces and terrify their Japanese opponents in equal measure, reshaping Pacific naval warfare in ways no one had anticipated when the conflict began.